final video on bones and bony landmarks of the human body, and we'll finish up with a discussion on the upper limb. And so we'll get started. Again, first you want to always orient yourself. And with the upper limb, it's kind of different. So if you think of the anatomical position, it's your thumbs are pointed out laterally, and your forearm is in a supine position, supinated. And so that's what we're going to look at all of these bones as. So if I have this arm right here, it is in the anatomical position, correctly like this. This is a left arm. That everything's oriented properly, but we don't want to forget the scapula and the clavicle, which is a very important part of the upper limb. So this is a right-sided scapula. Now if I want to look at this, the clavicle's already connected, but I have a extra one here. So the clavicle, there's two parts you want to be aware of. We have two ends, basically. We have the acromial end and the sternal end. The sternal end, we can see, kind of loops around, kind of S's out, and then the acromial end has this more rounded portion, and it comes back in. And you can always even feel that if you want to double check on yourself. You know, okay, your clavicle is more out, and you feel it coming towards your sternum, and then it comes back in before it hits your acromion of your scapula. So that's just kind of a helpful way of being aware of the scapula, or the clavicle in relation to the scapula and the midline of your body. So we'll look at our clavicle, or our scapula, and we'll look from an anterior portion first. So again, this is anterior. This is the lateral side of the body. This is the medial side. So first we look at this fossa right here. This is where I like to start, and that's called the subscapular fossa. This is where the subscapularis muscle will rest. So it makes sense. Then we have several different borders. We've got lateral border of the scapula, which goes right around here, and a medial border of the scapula. The lateral border is also can be called the axillary border, and the medial border can also be called the vertebral border. Then we have the best point of the scapula, most inferior, is the inferior angle. And then we have the superior angle before the superior border. So that takes care of this anterior part of the scapula. Now we're going to move up a little bit, and we have this portion right here. This bony prominence is called the Coracoid Process. So the Coracoid Process, which is kind of like a little hook, and it will go down and hook up with right here, which is called the Glenoid Fossa. This is the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Right here, the very most inferior part, we have the infraglenoid tubercle, and then we also have a supraglenoid tubercle. This glenoid fossa will actually articulate with the head of the humerus, and this is a left humerus, so don't worry about that. That's how it will move and articulate. It's part of the shoulder joint. So now we're going to start moving on posteriorly. This is the posterior view. This major part of the scapula that you can actually feel on your shoulders, that bump at the end of your shoulder right here, is called the acromion. From the acromion, we'll go back medial. Again, we're looking medially now. From posterior angle, so this is medial, this is lateral. Right from the acromion, we have the spine of the scapula. Now the spine of the scapula actually separates these two fossas. This topmost one is called the supraspinous fossa, which is home to the supraspinatus muscle. So again, this all makes sense. That's what I love about the upper limb. Below the scapula, or below the spine of the scapula, is the infraspinous fossa, which, as you can guess, is where the infraspinatus fossa would be. So after we have our infraspinous, supraspinous fossa, which you can see on the anterior portion of the scapula, this little notch is called the suprascapular notch, and that's where we actually have some nerves. The suprascapular nerve comes from the brachial plexus, and we'll come over here. So that's our scapula, quick and simple. Scapula and clavicle, it's not too bad. Next, we're going to move on to the humerus, which is the only bone of the arm proper, the brachium. So this is the left arm, again, the left humerus. Same as with this. So again, to orient ourselves, we find the head of the humerus. And it's always going to be medial, because it always articulates with the Coronoid Fossa. So from the head, we have actually two necks. So where all the other bones, the long bones of the body, have just one neck. Here we have two. Right along the ridge here, along the head, is called the anatomical neck. We move more inferiorly, more distally, and right around here is called the surgical neck. So that's just good to know a difference. The way I used to remember it is you're more likely to break your bone along here than actually over here, surgical neck. So those two different necks. Between the anatomical neck and the surgical neck, we have two tubercles. The most lateral one is your greater tubercle. It's bigger, obviously. And then the medial one is your lesser tubercle. So you can actually feel like your greater tubercle if you feel it up there at the most superior part of your arm, near your acromion. Between those, we see this little groove, and this is called the intertubercular, or the bicipital groove. Bicipital referring to the biceps brachii. It'll actually go right through here. It attaches up on the acromion. So, going from the bicipital or the intertubercular groove, we continue down the body of the humerus. If we look just on the lateral side, there's a rough portion. And a good giveaway to the fact that it's rough, it's about midway down, it's on the lateral side. This is the deltoid tuberosity. That's where your deltoid muscle will attach down here on your arm. So deltoid tuberosity, and we'll continue on down until we hit these ridges we can see right here. Now these are called your supracondylar ridges because they're above the condyles. We have a medial one on this side, the medial supracondylar ridge, and the lateral supracondylar ridge. Again, medial is on the same side as the head of the humerus. So then in the supracondylar ridges, will run into the condyles themselves. We have a medial condyle right here and a lateral condyle. Now, both of these, again, have epicondyles, medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. But of more interest is actually, we have some unique named structures right here. So first, we see two fossa right here. There's one right here and one right here. The most medial fossa is called the Coronoid Fossa. The most lateral fossa is called the Radial Fossa. Now, I try and commit to memory the fact that you have the Coronoid Fossa. What always helps me with is the Radial Fossa. Everything that we talk about in the upper limb that's radial is going to be lateral side. Because we remember anatomical position, your thumb is going to be lateral. So if your thumb's lateral, your thumb, everything, your radial bone, your radius, radial nerve, radial artery, everything is going to be on that lateral side. So if between these two fossa, the most lateral fossa, the radial fossa, should make sense. So just distal to the radial fossa we have this little protrusion right around here. Remember, we've got two of them. We've got one here, one here. The one that's below the radial fossa is called the capitulum. The one that's medial and just below the coronoid fossa is called the trochlea. Something to help me remember this is they don't seem like they have any kind of relation to each other at all. But what I think of as the coronoid fossa and the capitulum, they both start with C and they're lateral or they're diagonal to each other. For some reason, that I just remember that. I don't know how well that works, but you know, if it helps you go with it, it's cool. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to follow the trochlea all the way around to the posterior aspect of the arm. And the trochlea will finish up on this posterior part of the humerus. So again, we're looking posteriorly. So this is medial, this is lateral. The trochlea, the capitulum ends back on the anterior side. The trochlea will run into this deep pit, and this pit is a fossa. It's called the Electron Fossa. As we'll see next, the Electron process of the ulna will actually articulate when you're in full extension. And then if we continue on up, again, we're looking posteriorly, we can see this little groove, this little line, and this is called the radial groove. So that takes care of the humerus. So now, we'll move on down to the antebrachium, or the forearm, which is comprised of the radius and the ulna. So we'll we can start looking at, we'll look at both of these models. First, we'll look at by itself. We have the radius and we have our ulna. Now, just looking at it like this, our radius is going to be on the lateral side. This is a left forearm. So lateral radius. And it's always going to be shorter than the ulna, which is the longer one. It also has this unique process. So we'll start medial lateral. We'll look at the ulna first. Now, starting here, the most superior portion, this is called the Electron Process. That is the point of your elbow. You know, when you're swinging bows, that's the thing that connects and hurts people. So, Electron. And that is actually what you can see here, posteriorly, that articulates with the Electron Fossa. Okay. So, Electron. As we go down between the Electron and the Coronoid Process, we've got a little notch here, and this is called the trochlear notch. And the trochlear notch, as its name would suggest, articulates around the trochlea of the humerus. So that's all very helpful to know, just to be aware of. So we will look up here and at the head of the, or this most superior part of the ulna, where it actually touches with and articulates with the radius, is called the radial notch, meaning, you know, in reference to the bone that it articulates with. If we continue on down the ulna, again, we're looking on the medial side, where this metal pole is. You can see this little, my probe is now, there's a little process, and that's called the Styloid process of the ulna. And you can feel that on your medial side, on your wrist. Just feel around in there. So that's the ulna. If we go now look lateral, we've got our radius bone, the radius. The radius, the first thing we see is the radial tuberosity. It's this big bump right here, rough bump, like we're all familiar with our tuberosities. We continue on distally, and we see this notch that articulates with the ulna, and that is the ulnar notch of the radius. So, and before we actually finish off and move off to the hand, I was just remembering just like we have a radial tuberosity on the radius, there's an ulnar tuberosity on the ulna. You just can't see it quite as well, but that's where it is. Ulnar tuberosity, radial tuberosity. So now we'll move on to the hand. This is our last little portion. Now, again, this is very similar to what we went through on the foot. So, looking at the hand, again, we want to orient ourselves properly. This is a left hand. We have our thumb, which is always radial side, lateral side, medial side. So, our carpal bones, there's 2 rows to them. And I always try and remember it in a lateral to medial direction. So our first row, the proximal row, the most lateral bone is going to be right here. And this bone is called the scaphoid bone. It articulates with the radius. The scaphoid bone is right here. We'll move medial, and we have the lunate bone. Medial to the lunate, you can see it right here, is the triquetrum. And then on top of the triquetrum, you can see it's got this screw sticking out of it. If we look from a lateral or a medial angle, you can see that it can rotate. It's a small little bone right there. I'll just kind of move it. That's called the pisiform. And so we'll come back to that when we look on a dorsal surface too, because you can't see it dorsally. So, again, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform. Next, we'll move to the distal row of metacarpals. We'll look again laterally, and the bone that is right next to the first metacarpal is the trapezium bone. Next to the trapezium, just medial to the trapezium, is the trapezoid, which we can see just poking out right here. Medial to the trapezoid is the capitate bone. And then medial to the capitate, finally, is the hamate. And the hamate, we can definitely tell, it's got this thing, it's the hook of the hamate. And we can see it from both angles. You can see it sticking out right there. The hook of the hamate. So, just to go over this now again on the dorsal surface, because that's fun, we'll flip over and we'll look dorsally, just so we can be aware of what's going on. So, thumb side, radial side, this is lateral, this is medial. So let's look at this proximal, or distal, or dorsally. The most proximal, let's go through all of them, you know. So, the most lateral in the proximal row is the scaphoid. Then we have the lunate. Then we have our triquetrum bone. Now, you can't see on this side the pisiform, but it's right here. And it's that little bone that you're not going to be able to see dorsally. And it just sits right on top of the triquetrum on the palmar aspect. Next, we move on to the distal row. Again, the bone that's right adjacent to the first metacarpal is the trapezium. Medially, trapezoid. Move more medially, the capitate. And then the most medial, the hamate. If you want to double check, there's the hook. So, now we're back to the palmar aspect, and this is going to be just review essentially. It's the same exact thing as the foot, except instead of metatarsals, we have metacarpals. So, again, starting lateral, we go first metacarpal, second, third, fourth, fifth metacarpal, first being the thumb, most lateral. Now, there are phalanges again. Again, the first metacarpal only has 2 phalanges associated with it, proximal and distal. The second metacarpal, which is again the second digit, has 3, one of which is missing. So we'll look at the third one. We have our proximal, middle, and distal phalanx. So again, as with the lower limb and the feet, if I were to tag this structure right here, I'll wrap my probe around. So right there, this would be the distal phalanx of the fourth digit, digit 4. So, easy enough. And that is the upper limb. So again, as before, if you have any questions, feel free to ask your professors, TAs, feel free to go through this video as many times as you'd like, and to go over the self-check quizzes. And I hope this is a good help to you, and good luck the rest of the way.